All right, good morning, guys. Just playing around with a few videos here talking about the Watchmen. I've heard the Watchmen mentioned. We had the HBO miniseries a couple of months ago, and again, this is the second video. I did one previously the day before this, talking about Watchmen. What I'm looking at are some insights and things a lot of people have missed, things that I've never really seen anybody talk about in Watchmen in depth or even have a clue they were there. And there may be a third video. I don't know. I don't want to get into it. But this one we're going to talk about Rorschach. And one of the best ways to understand Rorschach is to understand the comparison of him with Adrian Veidt, Ozymandias. Now, I'm going to assume that people have read The Watchmen or that are familiar with it because basically the book was designed, like this is the absolute edition that we have here, hardback. But the book was actually designed to show everything that can be done in a comic book with this medium that can't be done in any other medium. That includes, novels, television, movies, anything like that. So the complete Watchmen is the way to read this. It's designed where you sit down with it, maybe have a glass of wine or a beverage, and you read it straight through, and then you're able to flip through back and forth because there's some revelations that I would, if I could ever sit down with Alan Moore, there's a revelation in this that I'm sort of wondering, was this planned or did they hit this kismet and it was a happy accident? Because there's a revelation that towards the end, issue 11, that makes it possible for you to start flipping back and forth and putting a few things together. And that's what's really amazing about this book. I feel like there's been a lot of people who have picked up the book, thought it was overrated, didn't like it. And again, I'm going to say it, if it's not your cup of tea, that's fine. But it takes multiple readings to catch everything in this book. And I've been reading this book since 1988, and I still catch things here and there every now and then. Of course, the big revelations and the big things that I put together grow further and further apart over the years, but it just amazes me they're still there. It's almost like when I relax my mind, it gels and I see it. So Rorschach is one of the great characters that come out of this, and the irony of the Watchmen title is that they were never a group. That this was never a team. The Watchmen was not a team. But all the characters, in my view, really are connected like cogs in a watch. And one of the things that really winds this watch up and gets the cogs moving again is Rorschach. Now, of course, Rorschach is really based, he's based on The Question and a character by Steve Ditko, who also created The Question, of Mr. A. Mr. A reflected a philosophy that Steve Ditko had that everything is black and white. There are no shades of gray. Everything, and then there should be no compromise. There's right and wrong, and that's it. He based this on a book he read in the 50s and stuff, right? So we have Rorschach who comes in. Now, this being a comic book and this being characters in the real world, why would people become comics and stuff? Rorschach is very unhinged, and he's been unhinged since he did a case where, what's the word I can find here, of a kidnapped little girl and finding out her fate. Let's put it that way, right? And he became Rorschach. He was Walter Kovacs putting on a mask, and it turns around, and this is playing around with the comic trope of secret identities. And this is connected with Adrian Veidt also. We'll just go straight through. But anyway, heroes have been outlawed since 77. He has never compromised. He has never, ever quit. And the police are after him and everything. And he's going to investigate this murder that's really setting things in motion, considering at this point it's been 8 years since any of the other heroes in the book have been active. But he's never quit. But the other thing that really gets me is that if you look at the outfit that he has, okay, the trilby hat, that's not a fedora, it's a trilby. Real men know their hats. The overcoat, the sort of the business suit, his ideal of what a real man looks like in the world, considering and this comes from him never knowing who his father was. And his mother was, more or less had men in and out of the house taking money. She was a woman of ill repute, if you will. He has the ascot on there, which always kind of cracked me up. But the other thing is that this is just a downright detective. Watchmen at its base is a sci-fi mystery story, and uh, and that's the thing. He's like a Raymond Chandler character. As I go through this first issue here, real quick, flipping through here, Rorschach is out there in the world, not hiding from the police. He's careful. He takes off his mask, and he does a thing that you can compare with Batman that people have talked about. What is the secret identity? Is Bruce Wayne is actually the secret identity. Batman is the identity. We're at a point in his life where Rorschach is the identity, who he really is, and it's Walter Kovac that is the secret identity, if you will, flipped it on its head. And what's great about this is that what Adrian Veidt does in this book and what Rorschach, how he's introduced in this book, we were fooled along with the rest of the people in the world of Watchmen. We actually would see Walter Kovac walking around, but we wouldn't notice him. And then the big revelation of we've seen the character before when he had his mask pulled out. Adrian Veidt fooled us in the same way. But he's like a character from a Raymond Chandler movie because he goes and sees all these characters and he enters their world. He's the same character in all of these different worlds. Dan Dryberg is wealthy and he lives in this little townhouse hidden from the world. He's gave up being a superhero. We go downstairs and we see, after he pops in there, we see, he wants to, if we're going to talk superhero business, we go into the underground of the house, an old abandoned subway repair shop, where, we find out this was like his bat cave of Dan Dryberg, the night owl, right? But one of the things I want to point out that you need to remember is when Dan Dryberg comes here and he finds Rorschach in his house, there's a busted lock. And this, I'm going to get to that. We want to remember the locks. So Rorschach goes through this world, sees all the characters. We see a little bit of the underbelly, and he's always writing in his journal, and that gives this film noir Raymond Chandler feel of a voiceover like in a movie, in those old movies and stuff. We see him go to see Adrian Veidt, who one of the best ways to understand Rorschach is to understand Ozymandias. And he meets him in his big high rise, and this guy is a billionaire many times over and stuff, right? And this is the panel. This is the panel that if you've never read Watchmen is a clue to who the killer is. That's a famous panel once people did some rereadings of it. We see him go into the world of Dr. Manhattan and the Second Silk Spectre, working for the government, living on a military base, and he goes through there. And everybody's been living their lives, and Rorschach comes in, walking around, monologuing, looking at the world where all these people are hidden in their homes, if you will, in their military bases, in their jobs and everything like that, and they're not who they are. Rorschach is still out there in the world taking in everything, but due to his, looking at things in the black and white nature and stuff, it's very dark. Which we come over here to the two heroes coming together to have a dinner, and they're reflecting on old superhero days. All of a sudden, everything that they're not allowed to do, that's what they've ended up talking about. So that's one of the magics of it, man. But so when we get into where does Rorschach really come out and we get to know him, and the way we get to know him is in the famous scene where he's in prison. He's been captured, and this is the first time that we actually see Rorschach confined in a building, if you will, in a mind. In the first issue, we saw everybody in their houses, going into their houses, hanging out at the military base. Rorschach's out in the world. He gets caught. He is thrown into prison. People want to kill him and be famous, and we get the famous scene where he throws the grease into the prisoner's eye. But his psychiatrist says that it was unnerving what he said after that. He turned to the inmates after he threw the grease in the one guy's face for trying to shank him there. And he tells him, none of you understand. I'm not locked up in here with you. You're locked up here with me. One of the things about Watchmen that a lot of people that I have interpreted, in my opinion, is that whenever they're inside of these buildings and this home, it's a reflection of these people's minds, what's inside there. And now all these people are locked in Rorschach's minds. He has gotten in their heads. He's unlocked them, busted that lock. He starts affecting the psychiatrist. The psychiatrist, was supposed to try to help him and also become famous, but he ends up invading this man's world to where he loses his wife and his kid and his friends, and he goes into this dark place when he explains how he wasn't Rorschach yet, but he is now. Now we're going to take a break there and go back here, and I want to look at Adrian Veidt. Now the thing about Veidt is we just saw him in his high rise. Adrian Veidt revealed his secret identity. He was Ozymandias and is Ozymandias. And the irony is that he was one of the first heroes that got the public's trust and started, getting this fortune built up after he supposedly quit superheroes. He was able to use his super intellect to figure out that eventually people were going to turn on the heroes and not want them around. So he has this place in Antarctica that he lives at. So we've seen Adrian Veidt with two places. And that's what's amazing is that he doesn't need the mask to have the secret identity. By taking off that mask, people automatically assume that he's showing everything that he is to the public. Downright to have, downright that the public has stock in his many businesses and stuff, right? But we go down to the Antarctic into his Fortress of Solitude, his sanctum, his sanctum, and this is where we see that just because he took off the mask, he too is now portraying a falsehood to people. Okay, this is the real person down here, and he is plotting to change the world. And like I said, remember the lock that got busted by Rorschach here, right? But you have Rorschach, who's in a self-imposed poverty, staying out there in the world and things, and pretty much we're reading his journal as he goes along. The man is completely open about who he is and what he is once he decides he wants to tell people. But the biggest thing is Ozymandias, he really based his life philosophy and everything he ever did apparently on Alexander the Great. And he has this picture up here of Alexander the Great looking at a rope that's been cut and other people watching him. The significance of this is that when he goes through telling his origin of these people as they're dying, is that you have this one panel while he's telling his origin that really just kind of sticks out of nowhere. He goes, perhaps because of the challenge it presented, the ancient world's greatest puzzle was there, a knot that couldn't be untied. Alexander, talking about Alexander the Great, cut it in two with his sword. Lateral thinking, you see, centuries ahead of his time. And at 18, I think it was 18, Adrian Veidt gave up his family fortune that he inherited when they died, and with no money at all, he traveled the same path across Europe and India and into Africa that Alexander the Great did. And it was this panel here that was sticking out that had me wondering what was going on. Why was that there? Because everything means something when you have a real writer working on a novel, book, comic, movie, whatever. Nothing's wasted. So we go back here to help to understand Rorschach and maybe go back and flip back in this panel. What's really cool about the way I'm showing this is how I figured it out. In a very condensed amount of time. I'm going straight back and forth. But one of the things that people liked is the comic in the comic. There's some heavy stuff called the Black Freighter. In a world of superheroes, Alan Moore kind of thought, you know what, people wouldn't read about superheroes. What would they read about? And they went to pirates. And this is a man who got shipwrecked, a black freighter full of dead men, if you will, coming at him, a dead man's ship coming at him. Black Freighter is really about the descent of Adrian Veidt going into madness, symbolically and stuff. So as the ship had, he got stranded on a desert island, all the bodies of his friends and shipmates were coming up on the beach. He took their bodies, made of wood frame, and he's floating on the dead bodies, trying to get back home before the Black Freighter can get to his hometown and his family. And right in the middle of his trip, this great big huge shark comes after him. There's another panel in here where they get a tip, the police get a tip of where Rorschach is, and they think the person on the other end of the phone is saying raw shark. And I'm like, Rorschach, raw shark. Rorschach, of him coming up there, and he ends up defeating the shark and ends up floating on it too, just like he was the dead bodies. This is how Rorschach and Veidt are tied. And then all of a sudden you get in there and you understand more about Rorschach by seeing how these two characters are more alike than you think. One of the famous panels of Adrian Veidt here is when he gets attacked by an assassin that he held. There it is. Okay. An assassin busts in, starts shooting at Veidt. Veidt takes him down. puts his fingers in the guy's mouth, saying that there's a capsule. He wants to know who sent him, and it's a cyanide capsule. Real old school comic trope there, if you will. Having a fake tooth and biting into it, a la James Bond and war stories and all this stuff. Well, much like Rorschach fooled us walking around with his mask off, and we didn't know it was him, his red-headed, ugly appearance and stuff, if you will. You have Vite, who is supposed to be like this good-looking rich guy, fooling us as well. When these characters fool the people in the real world and the people in the room with them, Adrian Veidt is not trying to keep this guy from swallowing a cyanide pill. He's shoving it down his mouth. He's killing him in front of everybody and the reader, and you didn't realize it. And that's where I started, and this is what I'm saying to understand Rorschach and Adrian Veidt. Rorschach, mostly you got to look at Adrian Veidt, and you start realizing in a warped way, Rorschach is just as intelligent, if not more to a certain extent, as Adrian Veidt. Adrian Veidt really worked and followed the path of Alexander the Great, sort of trying to be him and reuniting the world the way that Alexander the Great did through conquest. Adrian Veidt wants to be that person who discovers a new way of thinking by doing the knot, wherein you have Rorschach, who just is. He just busted the lock to get into. He doesn't try to crawl through a window. He doesn't try to pick a lock. He doesn't knock. He doesn't wait for somebody to get home. He just busts through the lock. A lock is nothing, and he's never given up. So you have these two characters. Like I said, all the characters sort of are connected, like like inside of a watch. The cogs in a watch and stuff, right? And that's what gets me. That's why I think Adrian Veidt gets really petty. To a certain extent, because it was through sheer force of will and not compromising that Alexander the Great at such a young age conquered so much of the world. Yet you have Rorschach, who sort of has that same compulsion. He even says that when people put on costumes to go out and fight things in the real world, it's not because they do it to be virtuous, it's because it's a compulsion. So here's Adrian Veidt working his entire life to be like Alexander the Great, and Rorschach just is, when you really look at this. Now, one of the things with that Gordian knot, if you haven't read Watchmen, you're going to get a basic spoiler here, but thanks to Adrian Veidt wanted to bring world peace, because in the world of Watchmen, due to the Cold War, we're on the brink of nuclear war, and he wanted to reunite the world and have it all be, in peace, much like he thought Alexander the Great was bringing to the world. So he looks at that Gordian knot for inspiration, different ways of thinking. How can I do this? What can I do? So what we really need to do is go back to looking at the people in here. We're going to be talking about the knotheads, the gangs that people overlook. They're just characters in here running around. Let's get to the Halloween stuff here. So when Rorschach busts out of prison, it causes this gang, the knotheads, to be running around. Let me find it. Oh, great. I should have checked it out there first. So these knotheads here's a picture of them. They're a gang that runs around with the kids and stuff, right, of the 80s, and they all have these knots on their head where they pulled the hair up, right? They're knotheads. They're gangs. They're territorial. They get into mob thinking. They're paranoid, they're uninformed, and they feed off of each other, and they hate the heroes. And what people miss is that these guys are a symbol of humanity, where they're so tribal and things, and they hate the heroes, and they go in and they end up taking down Hollis Mason now that he's retired, and they kill him, and then they get away with it and stuff. And these characters are really overrated. Not overrated, but overlooked, right? But think about the Gordian knot and the knot on top of their heads. One of the things that is symbolic of this, when you look at the locks, the knots and everything, it's changing the way people think. How do you untie that knot on top of their head to get them to think different? It's on their head, so it's symbolic of their way of thinking. You know what I'm saying? Getting in their head. And that's what Ozymandias did figure out. but he did it through having secrets. You have Rorschach, you have the character of Ozymandias who gave up his secret identity supposedly, which means, I'm showing my face, I have no secrets from the world, yet he has the most secrets. He killed 3 million people. You come over here to Rorschach, who's misunderstood because that face, his mask is his face. That's who he really is. And what does he do? Where you have Ozymandias having more secrets now than when he wore the mask and had a secret identity. You have Rorschach, who is writing his journal, and he freaking mails it right in there, his innermost thoughts, everything he's doing. He is the one that really has no secrets. You just have to understand Rorschach. And his journal was mailed to be printed. Of course, his big motivation was to expose Adrian Veidt for killing 3 million people. He didn't know he was doing that at the time, but he was exposing Adrian Veidt with whatever conspiracy was going on. But he has at least secrets. He's willing to take his journal and let people read his innermost thoughts and everything in there. There's no secrets. There's no compromise. And that's how you have to understand Rorschach. If you understand Rorschach, if people in this world had understood Rorschach, we would know how this book really followed up.